Hello, everyone. Andy Thompson here from CyberArk Labs. And today I wanted to bring to your attention a recent attack that really warrants all of our attention. Recently, there was a nation state attack upon a global tech giant. And what's interesting to note about this attack is that it entirely centers around privilege and identity. My name again is Andy Thompson, and I am the Senior Offensive Security Research Evangelist for CyberArk Labs. We're an offensive research team based in Israel, and it's my job to represent the team and share with you our research. I'm SSCP and CISSP certified by ISC Squared, and I'm also a GX certified pen tester. But what I'm most proud about is being one of the organizers and the MC for the Dallas Hackers Association, where I'm known as the resident travel hacker. I love traveling the world and doing it as cheaply as possible. I'm also a mentor. Because if it wasn't for certain people, I wouldn't be in this industry and where I am today. And so this is my way of giving back to the community and returning the favor. Now, if you want to keep up to date with all the latest research coming from CyberArk Labs, I'd recommend that you check me out online. And if you're brave enough, go ahead and scan this QR code on the screen and you'll get all of my contact information on a webpage. Now, in my time here at CyberArk, it's really been a goal of mine to present to you timely, accurate, and vendor agnostic guidance against the threats that we're seeing in the wild today. Now, there's still information slowly being disclosed regarding breaches like this, so oftentimes we don't have an entire grasp of the situation yet. With that said, I do plan to cover the information that we know so far. Some of this information may be subject to change. Now, let's get started with today's discussion. I'm first going to start out by identifying who this threat actor is and cover some of their more notorious attacks. Then I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened at Microsoft, again, based on the information so far. Lastly, I'm going to introduce to you how implementing several technical controls and best practices could have helped hinder this attack. All right, so let's get started. Who exactly is APT29? The United States government has classified this threat actor as Advanced Persistent Threat 29. Now, they also go by a host of different names depending on whom is doing the research on this threat actor. They go by many different names from Blue Kitsune, Solar Storm, Nobelium. Microsoft calls them Midnight Blizzard, but most people know them by the silly little name that CrowdStrike has given them. They go most often known as Cozy Bear. Now, despite the name, this is by no means a cute and snuggly threat actor. The official name given to this organization is the Russian SVR, or Sluzba Внешней Разведки, aka the Foreign Intelligence Service. This is one of Russia's primary intelligence agencies responsible for foreign intelligence gathering. They were created in 1991 following the fall of the Soviet Union and the restructuring of the KGB. Their primary objectives include acquiring political, economic, and military intelligence in order to gain a competitive advantage, ultimately supporting the geopolitical goals and enhancing Russia's influence on the global stage. Now, the SVR operates directly under the jurisdiction of President Vladimir Putin. He can actually send and issue any sort of secret order to the SVR without having to consult any other governing body. They also will send the president daily briefs or digests of intelligence, which is actually very similar to the United States president's daily briefing, where unlike the US, where the intelligence agencies attempt to provide unbiased intelligence in order to leave the policy decisions to the president, the SVR's briefing actually will recommend certain policy options in which they deem more preferable. And on occasion, Cozy Bear will often be known to work with other Russian intelligence agencies. You may have heard of the Russian Military Agency, or the GRU, affectionately named Fancy Bear. Now, Fancy Bear is more infamous because it's a military operation, whereas Cozy Bear is far more covert. which in my opinion makes them almost, if not more dangerous. Again, Fancy Bear is more of a military operation, whereas Cozy Bear is a intelligence and espionage unit. Now, Cozy Bear has rightfully earned that reputation as far as being one of the most advanced and elusive threat groups in the world. Evidence suggests that this group has compromised multiple government institutions, including Germany, Uzbekistan, Norway, and the United States. So, here are a few more of the notable attacks that have been attributed to this group. First, we have in 2015 the attack on the Pentagon. Uh, Cozy Bear had been linked to the Pentagon in facilitating spear phishing attacks. This ultimately led to the entire shutdown of the Pentagon's email systems and their internet access during the duration of their investigations. Next up, we have in 2016 the Democratic National Committee. Now, in June of 2016, Cozy Bear was implicated alongside the Fancy Bear GRU unit. They were actually operating in the same network, unbeknownst to each other. They were actually doing many of the same things like acquiring passwords and replicating each other's actions, which ultimately led to forensic teams discovering their access. And what's interesting to note here is that Cozy Bear had actually been in the network for well over a year, whereas Fancy Bear had only been in the network for a couple of weeks. Moving forward to 2016, post election, Cozy Bear had been discovered operating in American think tanks and other NGOs. Moving forward to 2017, Cozy Bear had conducted multiple phishing campaigns against key Norwegian organizations, including the Labor Party, Foreign Affairs, even the Radiation Protection Authority had been compromised. The Prime Minister of Norway was aptly quoted saying that Cozy Bear was a grave assault on their democratic institutions. Now, let's fast forward to late 2019, early 2020. You've probably heard about the supply chain attack upon SolarWinds. At this time, Cozy Bear had compromised the SolarWinds network and injected their own malicious code into SolarWinds software updates. And that ultimately resulted in SolarWinds accidentally sending the Sunburst malware to almost 18,000 of SolarWinds clients. Now, later in 2020, during the height of the pandemic, Cozy Bear was accused by the NSA, among other global intelligence agencies, stating that they were trying to steal medical information and research on vaccines and other COVID-19 research that were being developed in the United States, Canada, and the UK. Also, that following year, they were attributed to compromising the U.S. Republican National Committee. This was believed to have bled over from a compromise of the RNC's managed service provider. Now we have in 2023, Cozy Bear developed a tool called Magic Web. This was a post exploitation tool that allowed for the manipulation of authentication certificates on Active Directory Federation services. This allowed them to basically masquerade as any user on that network. Which now leads us to 2024 and the most recent attack upon Microsoft. Now, as I mentioned before, there is limited information currently available regarding this breach. It's not said publicly yet how APT29 was able to identify this environment and the identity which ultimately led to the compromise of the environment. Now, some assumptions are being made here. I'm going to show you a couple ways that if I were a malicious nation state that I would have done this research. Now, if I knew a particular IP range that the organization was using, I might try to use a port scanner like Nmap here to scan for any services that were publicly accessible via the internet. Now, with this query here, I can figure out what sort of servers are serving up web pages, for example. Now, Another method that's even easier would be to use a service here like Shodan.io. This is a very, very powerful search engine that can be quite dangerous if used by the wrong person. By simply searching for a vulnerable application, perhaps something that's like end of life, like WordPress 6.3 here, Shodan will pull up every single instance of that application that's running all over the world. Now, I have seen terrible things, folks, using Shodan. I've seen unprotected NAS and network storage that's filled with personal information like medical records and legal documents. I've also seen working webcams that the end users didn't know was publicly accessible. I've even seen industrial control systems belonging to critical infrastructure that were available for remote access. Again, it's a scary world, folks, and all of this information is on a search engine. That's how easy it is to zero in on a environment that you might want to attack. Now that you might have that target that you want to attack, this is where a threat actor would need to figure out what sort of identity they'd use to facilitate the initial breach. Now, this sort of information, again, hasn't been disclosed, but we don't know if this was a interactive account or a service account, but really it doesn't matter. Today, I'm going to show you how a threat actor would use some sort of a OSINT tool like LinkedIn in order to identify their potential victims. So if I was a threat actor, I'd want to check out which organizations might be using an application like Office 365. Using LinkedIn, I could just search for employers that are hiring for those sorts of privileges. And once you know that, you can then look for administrators of that application within that organization. It's really basically that easy. And then with a few more other searches, you can find a ton of other information, such as previous employers, their alma mater, and other information like their pets, family, hobbies. All of this sort of information makes for making one heck of a password list. Another method would be to cross-reference existing data dumps. Recently, researchers discovered what they call the MOAB, or Mother of All Breaches. This is a database that's 12 terabytes large and contains a meticulous indexed list of 26 billion usernames and passwords. But don't get all in a tizzy, folks. It's not as bad as it actually sounds. This data isn't particularly new. It's a compiled collection of previous data dumps, and many of these credentials are stale and have since been changed. But even with that sort of information, a threat actor can, again, further refine their authentication attacks. And again, we don't know how Cozy Bear was able to zero in on that target environment and the selected target identity. But again, I think this is a pretty good guess, which now will lead us to the actual attack that was conducted upon Microsoft, the password spray. All right, so a password spray is kind of like what it sounds like. You're peppering your target with authentication requests that make it very difficult to detect, okay? So for example here, we have our threat actor that has using something like either a botnet or a proxy server to send authentication requests to a target. And so this is done low and slow. Okay, it's coming in from different IP addresses, so it's really difficult to track the source origin. You're also doing it so slow that you're not locking out the account. So again, as this goes by very slowly but surely, you're ultimately going to hit on a credential that works. Again, this is done so slow that it is incredibly difficult to detect. So once you have a functional credential, you then log into the server. Now, what's interesting to note here in the Microsoft breach is there was no MFA. Yeah, not so good, right? So this is where OAuth, or Open Authorization, comes into play. This is a standardized protocol that's used for authorization and secure provisionment of privileges to resources, okay? This is used everywhere from applications to mobile phones and even IoT devices. It's part of that identity and access management process. People often mistake OAuth for open authentication, but no, it's authorization. That's what we're focusing on here. It allows users to authorize third-party applications only limited access and resources rather than just giving them full access to their privileges or even the credential. I like to think of this like a valet key. Now, a valet key is something you might not know about. It's available on more newer cars, but normally people drive around with the master key. Okay, it does everything: start and stop the engine, open the doors, but it also does other things like lock the glove compartment, pop the trunk, stuff like that. Now, if you're going to a fancy restaurant, you probably don't want that valet rummaging around in your stuff. So instead, you'd want to give them the valet key. Now, the valet key only has limited permissions, basically opening and closing the door and starting and stopping the engine. It has limited provisions, right? So that's what OAuth is ultimately in a nutshell. Okay. This is how OAuth is supposed to work here. The identity is authenticating to the identity provider. In this circumstance, it's Microsoft, but you've probably seen authentication through Twitter or Facebook and that sort of stuff. But then OAuth will provide the appropriate privileges to that third party application. Now, that's how it's supposed to work. But in the Microsoft situation, we had an over provisioned identity. And that's really where the crux of the issue started to happen here. Now, with this over provisioned identity, it was able to create new OAuth applications, okay? Malicious OAuth applications. And this particular credential had the ability to provision a role called the full access as app role. All right. Now, another thing that I really need to mention here is that the credential that was being used, that they initially compromised, was a legacy test environment. Okay. But that credential that was being used was also for a production environment. Okay. So that's how they were able to pivot into a production environment, spin up this new OAuth application, and provide that full access as app role to that malicious OAuth app, which led to the ability to read Office 365 mailboxes and the attachments. All right, so that's pretty scary. And again, they were able to read emails, attachments of senior executives, legal teams, and the threat hunters on the InfoSec team. Because what's really interesting to note here that Cozy Bear was looking for specific information. They were doing a little bit of introspection, and Cozy Bear was specifically looking for information on Cozy Bear. What it appears to be is that they were interested in understanding what the enemy, Microsoft, knew about them. They were wanting to know about the sort of countermeasures that Microsoft was using to prevent access and lure them in. They were looking to see what sort of exposed cloud infrastructure, IP ranges, and other sorts of tactics, techniques, and procedures that they knew about Cozy Bear. Stuff like that, right? Now, this, folks, was the entire attack. This is how it played out: to identifying this legacy test tenant, finding an identity that they could password spray and grab their initial access, and ultimately abuse this over provisioned OAuth role to read the mailboxes and attachments of senior level officials. That, folks, is how this global technical giant was compromised by Cozy Bear. All right, let's flip the script and look at things from the defender's perspective. Let's take a look at some of the misconfigurations. We'll first start off with what Microsoft deemed here was the affected environment was a legacy non-production test tenant. Now, organizations will often use multiple environments. It's not just prod. Like, for example, when I used to be an SAP basis admin, I was responsible for making changes in our test environment, our development environment, our QA environment. It wasn't just prod. And something I noticed during my time there was that often the security controls weren't applied to these lesser environments. It could be due to a ton of different reasons for operational efficiency. Sometimes these implementations of controls were very cost prohibitive, and they aren't necessarily needed in these lesser environments unless you're trying to test for the operations of it. And again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing unless these environments are connected to the internet. This unintentional configuration led to a huge opening of a can of worms in that non production environment. And again, that would be one thing if this was isolated to non prod, but it wasn't. It was exposed to the internet. Another question that was been brought up here was why was there no multi-factor? And at this point, there really isn't an answer. We still don't know if this was an interactive or a machine identity. So that's something to take into account here. But also, a common bad practice that I see in non production environments is that MFA isn't configured. Okay. Moving on, let's talk about the misconfiguration of the credential being used here. In this circumstance, the credential that was compromised wasn't just that legacy non production test tenant, it also was the same credential being used in their production environment as well. So that ultimately led to an easy pivot from that legacy non production test tenant into the production test tenant. Okay. So again, easily accessible, no multi factor, and the same credentials were used in prod. Now, let's move into the OAuth piece of the misconfigurations. First and foremost, the compromised credential was vastly over provisioned. Okay. We don't entirely know exactly what that role had the permissions or what it was intended to do, but we did know that it had the ability to create additional OAuth applications. That's one thing. And a significant thing, no less. But I think what the most damaging permission here that was granted was that full access as app role. That allowed for the maliciously created application to access those O365 mailboxes and attachments. And again, I believe that all of this was an oversight, common mistakes that anybody could have made. Like I said, I've seen other organizations make these mistakes. It's not just a Microsoft thing. Now, there are other recommendations here that correspond to preventing password spraying and OAuth abuse and other sorts of malicious actions. The following things are things that I would recommend that you should try to detect. First, logons with MFA. Duh, pretty self-explanatory. Next, you'd want to try to detect the reuse of credentials and enforce the rotation of that. Again, in my experience, I've seen credential reuse in crazy ways. I've seen the same credential on an endpoint to a server to a domain controller. I've seen the same credentials being used on Windows systems, the same on Mac, on the same as databases and Linux and Unix and network infrastructure, the same password, which again leads to easy lateral movement. Now, this is when we kind of look at OAuth. These are situations where you want to prevent a malicious actor from standing up the creation of new applications, but also you want to be able to monitor idle OAuth applications because just as easily the threat actor could take an existing OAuth application and change it and change the permissions in order to do the sorts of stuff that Cozy Bear did. Moving on, you want to be able to detect when new privileges are created. Again, in dev and test environments, oftentimes admins will create new credentials in order to test certain functionality or integrations and services and stuff. So you need to be able to detect that. And if you're going to be creating new credentials, you ought to probably go through some sort of change management request. That way, everybody's on the same page and everybody knows when new privileges are being instantiated in these environments. Also, these are things that you can detect when behavior is going on in the network. So if you start seeing activity of a user, but there's not an authentication that precedes that, that's something that's a bit suspicious. You want to investigate. Also, if a user is provisioned with MFA, but there's actions on the network, but there wasn't a previous MFA challenge, that's pretty sus too. Got to look into that. And this is when you see sometimes where a threat actor is hijacking a session and that session expires or is terminated. You might see some sort of actions that are occurring post expiration. Again, these are very indicative of session hijack attacks of cookies and other applications. Also, certain malicious commands and even non-malicious commands. For example, someone in accounting probably isn't going to be running ipconfig. They're probably not going to be running who am I, right? These sorts of things called lulbins or living off the land binaries are often used by threat actors because they're not having to pull down additional tools. These sorts of things should be monitored, detected, and responded against. And also, what you want to look at are attempts to bypass existing controls like PAM solutions, right? So, for example, if you were running a jump box and all privileged actions are being routed through that, and you've got somebody that's trying to VNC or RDP directly into a target, these things ought to be detected and responded to. Okay. And last but not least, you want to make sure that you're detecting things that are coming in from unknown sources, right? Anonymous proxies, botnets. These, again, can pepper an organization with authentication requests that make it fairly difficult to detect. But it is possible. And so these are the sorts of things that you want to detect. All right. I feel like I've done enough talking today. Thank you so much for listening to me discuss this really important data breach. I think it goes to show that nation state actors are a very real threat to us all. And I hope that this attack on Microsoft serves as a wake up call. And this isn't the last that we've heard from APT29 either. Just days after Microsoft's breach announcement, other tech giants have announced that they've fallen victim to this threat actor as well. And now that more organizations are sharing their indicators of compromise, I expect similar announcements from others to follow as well. And I should also mention this isn't just a Russia. This isn't just an APT 29 thing either. And we really need to recognize that the threat landscape isn't just isolated and limited to a single nation or threat group. Other countries are actively developing, conducting, and refining their cyber espionage capabilities and launching attacks with varying different motives. So, again, please stay vigilant. Thank you so much for your time. This is Andy Thompson from CyberArk Labs signing off. Have a great rest of your day.